afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Welcome, Ralph Metzner, back to Santa Fe. My name is Deborah Parrish-Snyder, and I'm the publisher at Synergetic Press. It's my great pleasure to introduce one of my favorite people, Dr. Ralph Metzner, who's conversational. Conversational memoir we published a couple years ago that he co-authored with Ram Dass about his time in the early 60s working with Timothy Leary and then known as Richard Alpert at Harvard. Ralph is a psychologist, psychotherapist, writer and researcher, professor emeritus of the psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, where he formerly was the academic dean and academic vice president. Dr. Metzner, he participated in the psychedelic research at Harvard in the early 60s, and he went on and became really a pioneer in early psychedelic and consciousness research, gone on to yoga, meditation, and shamanism. He's been involved in this for more than 45 years. He is co-founder and president of the Green Earth Foundation. That's an educational nonprofit devoted to healing the relationship between humans and the earth. He conducts workshops on consciousness transformation and alchemical divination, both nationally and internationally, and is also a poet and a singer-songwriter. Ralph is here tonight to share some of his stories from his explorations and reflect on the life of the most famous chemist of the 20th century, Albert Hofmann. That's to commemorate publication by Synergetic Press of Mystic Chemist.
Oh, bravo.
We launched this book at the MAPS conference in April of this year. That was the 70th anniversary of the discovery of LSD. And this is the Santa Fe launch.
What is it, MAPS?
MAPS is a multidisciplinary association for psychedelic studies. So I want to thank, Ralph is here to talk about some of these stories with Albert in his life and what Albert has meant to him. He's also going to talk about his current work and writings on worlds within worlds, worlds within and worlds beyond, which is the end of his consciousness, ecology and consciousness series. I want to thank our gracious host, Dorothy Massey of Collected Works, whose support of local authors and publishers is unmatched here in Santa Fe. Special thanks to Linda Sperling, who is the editor of Mystic Chemist, and several other people here in this room. We never could have done the book without Linda's champion work. John Cole, who's the book's designer, is here. We have also the Synergetic Press staff who worked very, very hard to make this book come into being. Debbie McFarlane, Graciela Ruiz, Jim Mafshir, who also helped us with this book, and Hugh Elliott. Thank you all for your super efforts to help make Mystic Chemist such a fitting tribute to the life of Albert Hofmann. And now let's make a warm welcome for Ralph Metzner.
Thank you, Tango. Thank you, the Bookstore, inviting me. Thank you for coming. So, talking about one of my favorite subjects and one of my favorite people in the whole world. I'll talk a little bit about Albert Hofmann first, and then I'll talk a little bit about the series of books that I'm publishing through the Green Earth Foundation. My involvement with psychedelics started when I was at Harvard University in the early 60s as a graduate student, working with Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, a dozen or so other graduate students and researchers doing experimental studies in psilocybin mostly and other substances, working with prisoner rehabilitation, applications and theology students, empirical researchers of the kind that one could really say, in the tradition of William James, it's radical empiricism. And radical empiricism means, according to William James's definition over 100 years ago, that all knowledge is based on experience. That's observations and experience. That's the empirical philosophy in general. You don't just make things up. It's based on observations. And radical empiricism is, however, radical in a way that modern science often is not. because modern science develops its paradigms, its structural worldviews, and then gets fixated in that and thinks that any observations that don't fit in that don't really belong. In that case, it stops being empirical. And the greatest scientists have always acknowledged that science is an open-ended system of knowledge, not a closed system of knowledge. Isaac Newton himself, often regarded as the greatest physicist who ever lived, in the 17th century, already said, I feel like a schoolboy who played at the great seashore of the mysterious and found a few pebbles shiny and interesting. Beyond me lies the great vast ocean of the unknown. So Einstein said the same thing, similar thing. He said the basis of true scientific knowledge is an attraction to the mystery. An attraction to the mystery. It's open-ended. It's mystery. We don't know it. We don't understand it. And therefore, we're motivated. And that sounds very much close to mysticism, you see. And Albert Hofmann was a prime example of a scientist, visionary scientist, mystic, who worked empirically according to all this criteria of empirical science, but throughout his life remained open, and in fact, to new discoveries and new aspects of old discoveries. In fact, he discovered LSD by accident, and which in itself is a very peculiar story, because he was a medicinal chemist, pharmaceutical chemist in Switzerland, working for a pharmaceutical company. People like that don't make accidental mistakes in their laboratory technique. It just doesn't happen. They're the most compulsive people on the planet. You don't accidentally absorb something through your fingertips. It never happens. And he himself acknowledged it's impossible. But what it turned out to be, the reason was because of the extreme potency of LSD, being 1,000 times more potent, and it's the most potent drug that's ever been discovered. And potency is different from power. Other drugs like mescaline can, for example, the power of the drug means how strong the effect is on whether it's a human or an animal. The potency is how little of the substance you need to reach that effect. So actually, LSD and mescaline are equally powerful, but LSD is 1,000 times more potent, because you're talking about micrograms rather than milligrams. An effective human dose of LSD can't actually be seen with the naked eye. 100 micrograms, you can't see it. You have to put into something else that makes it visible. So it's an extremely unusual drug. And Hofmann had the genius to recognize right at the beginning, through his accidental discovery, or really one could call it a serendipity, rather. A serendipity is an accidental discovery with really interesting and good consequences. Unexpected, but very extremely important consequences. And had the genius to recognize that this was not just another pharmaceutical. And I want to read you a passage from what he wrote a letter. So he as you've probably heard the story, he accidentally ingested some. He found himself in this very strange state that confused him and frightened him. He thought he was going to die. He rode home on his bicycle because of time expansion. It was a very long bicycle ride, and then that's become sort of mythical bicycle ride. But actually, within a few hours, once he was able to lie down and just close his eyes and let the visions appear, it changed, and it became a very, very positive experience. So then he told his superiors and colleagues at Sandoz Pharmaceuticals about his experience, and they said, well, we've got to test this right away. This is a new drug, da-da-da. So he took another dose of the drug in the medicinal pharmaceutical company of department of Sandoz with doctors and pharmacologists and pharmacists and people in white coats and lab coats and everybody there. And he went on a hell trip. And he made him, right there. And so he decided right there and then he's never going to do that again. And instead, after that, he intuitively said in all his trials and then he started doing sessions at home with people like Aldous Huxley and philosophers that he knew of, and arranged a tranquil, aesthetic setting, not a clinical pharmaceutical setting. He understood right from the get-go the importance of the set and the setting, the environment, and the attitude. And in this case, all the psychedelic drugs are completely different from all other drugs. Because in all other drugs, there's a certain setting, they're not that important. A tranquilizer will be a tranquilizer no matter where you are. In fact, that's why you can get a prescription for it, and you can take it anywhere, and you take it, twice a day, or whatever the doctor tells you. Same with stimulants, mood elevators. But with these so-called psychedelic drugs, the set and setting are crucial. And that's a formulation that was actually due to my old colleague and friend Timothy Leary. He said, you've got to understand the dosage and the set and the setting, because otherwise you're fooling around in the dark. And it can be very dangerous. And what I found in this biography, I didn't personally get to meet Hofmann until quite later on. I mean, we briefly met in the 70s and the 80s, and it's only in the last 10 years of his life, in the 90s, and he died at the age of 101 in 2007. 2007. But I used to come to Switzerland and visit with him every year and had wonderful conversations with him in his old age. And by that time, he was a world-famous chemist who had a large following. He had been retired from Sandoz for a long time. People came by the dozens from all over the world to visit with him and exchange ideas with him. He remained totally open and interested in what was happening and in the cultural, social implications of his discoveries. But what I came across in this book was a letter that he had written to Timothy Leary in 1961. That was the very beginnings of our research project at Harvard. And I just want to remind you, in case you don't know, all the research we did at Harvard, done with LSD and psilocybin, was done perfectly legal. The drugs were not illegal at that time. They were totally unknown. And nowadays, you say LSD and people have hallucinations of horror trips and jail terms and all of that. In those days, you could have said LSD, XYZ, who cares? What is it? Unknown, completely unknown. It's impossible for us now, including myself, to put us back into that social context. Because now we know, or think we know, all this other stuff. So in this letter that Hofmann wrote to Leary describing the early studies that we did with volunteer subjects, naturalistic setting, so have the setting be comfortable, not a clinic. That was Leary's realization, having taken the mushrooms in the village. Don't do this like a typical drug experiment in a laboratory. It's not a laboratory, it's not a clinic. It's not just a therapy place. So do in a supportive set and setting, a living room, a comfortable living room, and so people were there, had medical supervision if it was needed, or protection if it was needed, and listening to music, contemplating art, like that, and then describing their experiences, filling out questionnaires, like that. It was an empirical observation step, not double-blind placebo control. You see, that comes later. First, you've got to find what are you dealing with? What's actually happening here? So, 1961. So Leary wrote to Hofmann describing the earliest experiences that we had, and Hofmann answered him. And he said, I was just reading this book by Aldous Huxley, who was one of the inspirations for Hofmann and Leary and our project. They were really three great philosophers, all the three really important religious philosopher of the 20th century, Aldous Huxley, Houston Smith, who wrote a well-known book, bestseller book on the religions of man, and Alan Watts. Both knew and understand from an experiential basis the religious and spiritual and mystical implications of these substances. And So Hofmann says in a letter, thank you for sending me that and report on your preliminary results. And he says, my own experiences with psilocybin and earlier with LSD convinced me, as I have written to Mr. Huxley 2 years ago, that the use of this kind of drug should not be restricted to pharmacology and psychiatry, but they should be studied also in respect to their faculty to open up new doors of perception. It gave me, therefore, great satisfaction to study your interesting approach using psilocybin as a consciousness-expanding drug. You have realized the importance of the environmental factor of surroundings for the quality of the effects of psilocybin. Many psychiatrists who use LSD or psilocybin as an aid in psychotherapy don't pay attention to this point. The results of your studies, with the aim of determining the conditions under which optimal positive reactions with psilocybin occur, will also be important for the therapeutic use of this drug. So that really struck me because, as a result of reading this letter, which I only found out about, although they obviously knew it, also convinced me in my writings to no longer use the term psychedelic and go back to using the term consciousness expanding. The reason for that is psychedelic term has accrued all kinds of excess cultural, social, morally disapproving, misunderstanding associations. I mean, my 10-year-old daughter came back from school one day and said, oh, she'd seen some paisley patterns and said, woo, woo, it's psychedelic. She didn't have a clue about psychedelic drugs. It's a form of pop art. Psychedelic art is a form of pop art with paisley and swirling colors. So, when you say consciousness expanding, you see, it's does a whole other thing to your mind, because usually those two words are not connected. You gotta ask yourself, consciousness can expand? Who knew, right? Not only can consciousness expand, usually we think of consciousness as a sort of it's a very slippery concept, actually. It's sort of a background to everything, you know? And then there's arguments in the philosophy of science, is it derivative or is it basic? And consciousness can expand, and consciousness can also contract. We call that concentration or focus. And consciousness expands naturally every morning when you wake up. When you wake up out of a dream, you could be doing anything in a dream. You could be being, having a great time being in a foreign land, be interacting with people and places and totally unknown to you, expanding your knowledge, your experience. And then you gradually wake up and you say, oh, I'm here, this is my body. I'm lying in this bed, in my bedroom, next to my wife or husband. And there's my house, and my dog and my cat, and the garden, and my job, and the people I work with. And it's a progressive series of consciousness expansion when you wake up. And waking up is a metaphor in Buddhism and Hinduism for expanding consciousness. Waking up to ultimate reality, waking up to inner reality. Consciousness expanding is not necessarily good and consciousness contraction bad. It depends on the context and setting. If you're doing something that requires operating machinery, you don't want to be kind of expanding your consciousness. You want to be focused. If you're a concert pianist and giving a performance, you don't want to be expanding your consciousness and thinking about looking at the sunset outside the window. It's called concentration. And it's essential. It's essential for us to, for normal functioning, to be able to expand consciousness and concentrate consciousness under our own direction or intention. And that was the point of set and setting. Set is the intention, the context that you give to the experience. So LSD is a completely different drug and a completely different experience when used in an experimental setting, a therapeutic setting where it's being used with the intention of helping somebody heal their addictions or their alcoholism or something like that. Or if you're taking it at an acid test where your intention is to listen to the Grateful Dead and dance and enjoy the communication with others in the non-verbal contact. It's a completely different, it could be almost a different drug. And it's a very interesting kind of philosophical, cosmological paradox. And anybody who has ever looked into psychedelics, any scientist who's ever really studied it, knows that totally and experientially. And that therefore and this is a tremendous break away from the usual scientific paradigm. And we at Harvard experienced that right at the beginning, because Harvard at the time, at the 60s, as much mainstream psychology is still dominated by behaviorism, even though it's not quite as rigid as it was in the 60s. Behaviorism means the only thing you can observe is behavior. Therefore, forget the Skinner box. And Skinner was running rats and lab animals and behavior. Consciousness is basically non-existent. It's just an assumption. And William James, of course, who was a professor of psychology at Harvard 100 years ago, he already said, no, you can't do that, William James was a proponent of radical empiricism. And radical empiricism means that you don't exclude any observations from your science, no matter where they come from. So yes, we make observations in the external world, but you also make observations in the internal world. And this is what makes it scientific, is that you repeat the observations, you have different people make the observations, and you compare notes, and then you keep testing. And you have a theory, then you keep testing it. And you make a distinction between the observation and the theories. And you add, and that's how true science actually progresses. And much of psychology, doesn't get that. Because then they eliminate, for example, all of parapsychological observations, because they said, well, I don't care if your statistical level of significance is 0.001, in your telepathy experiments, because you're talking about something that's impossible. So science goes out the window for those people. To his credit, William James did not do that. And he himself did studies on parapsychology and the experiences that people have in near-death experiences. They didn't call them near-death experiences at that time, but an experience that he didn't know about LSD, of course, but he studied nitrous oxide, and he reported on nitrous oxide, which is an anesthetic, which people were studying in the late 19th century, and he said, from his experiences, he said, beyond the veil of ordinary perception, there are other realms of consciousness. They are completely different. And no science that doesn't take those into account can call itself a complete science. So it was very interesting for me to discover, William James's writings. And very recently, there's been a lot of research, for example, done between collaborations between Buddhist meditators, the Dalai Lama himself, and other lamas and Western psychologists studying the effects of meditation. And the Dalai Lama has come out with a statement that is exactly the same as the idea of William James of radical empiricism. He calls it first-person empiricism, because the usual empiricism is third person. See? And Harvard was caught in the behaviorist third-person empiricism. They said, you're not supposed to take these drugs. See, the department chair, that was his frustration at Leary. Yes, you should study this, but you should give it to other people, and observe their reactions. And Tim Leary used to say, well, there aren't any reactions to observe. It's all happening inside the person. You give somebody LSD, they lie down there and for 6 hours, and every now and again they go, that's amazing. So if you want to know what's happening, you have to actually ask them to describe it after the fact, So, but Harvard didn't get that, and they still haven't got that. Well, individuals know. Anybody who's worked with psychedelics, of course, understand it, and agree. Any psychologist, psychiatrist, doctor who's actually experimented with and used psychedelics themselves, and knows for a fact and agrees privately, even though publicly they can't agree, that. And in fact, it is the motivation that they have had personal experiences with it. I was at one meeting of this group called MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and my friend and colleague, this Jim Fadiman, who gave a talk, said in his talk, and he asked the audience, about 1,000 people or 1,500 people, he said all professionals and scientists, and some of them had government grants to study psychedelic drugs. And he, to the dismay of some of the other scientists in the circle, he said, more conservative, he asked the audience how many people had taken psychedelic drug, or whatever it might be, LSD, psilocybin, as part of a government-approved, NIMH-approved research projects, and about 6 or 8 people raised their hand. Then he said, how many people have experienced psychedelics? And everybody raised their hand, including all the researchers. But they can't say that in their applications to the government agencies that approve research. And they can only admit it in private, but because then they run the risk. So what that means is that the world, the experience expands a person's worldview, so they're no longer attached to the empirical, to the worldview of the modern world, which everything is tightly controlled. Which, incidentally, one could say, is actually the true scientist is always open to new observation. But drug research, for example, the MAPS group, they can't get government funding. They can't get funding from the pharmaceutical companies. They have to raise all their own money. So that's what's called the military-industrial pharmaceutical medical complex. That is what it is.
Yep.
It's all tied into money, and if there's no money to be made, that's why the pharmaceutical companies, no pharmaceutical company is ever going to do any research on these psychedelic drugs. None. Well, with the possible exception, the MAPS group is valiantly trying to push out. They have to fund all their research themselves, raise all the money, even after they get permission. And it's the same with marijuana. I was very happy to discover that letter from Hofmann. This book is a treasure trove of the dozens and dozens of people from all walks of life, scientists, artists, philosophers, social scientists, commentators, writers, because as a consciousness-expanding drug, it's of interest it's of interest to therapists and people working with therapy, but as Hofmann said right early on, and yes, he was of course in favor of continuing the studies and the hundreds of studies that were done with applying LSD in animal pharmacology and applying it in clinical settings, like the work that my good friend Stanislav Grof did in Czechoslovakia with applying it in intensive psychotherapy, and many other people did it, and all of the people who work in that field, therapeutically, the doctors, whether they can admit it or not, have themselves experienced the substance. And in fact, I would say it's unethical for a scientist to do human studies with psychedelics without having taken it himself. I would say that should be the rule, actually, if there's any rule. Now, of course, it goes completely against the mainstream science point of view. And that's why the psychedelics have implications for medicine, for science, for pharmacology, for psychology, for psychotherapy, and for spirituality. Because in the end result, these are, people can have, don't necessarily guaranteed, it's not a drug effect, but their effects can be, the experiences can be religious experiences and mystical experience. And Albert Hofmann had the genius and the insight to recognize that the experience he was having testing out this lab drug accidentally ingested because it reminded him of a mystical experience he'd had as a child 40 years before, where he suddenly felt, without taking any drug, was walking out in nature amongst the mountains and the trees and the flowers, this all-embracing oneness, love, total embracing and being held, blissful, that was the same experience. And he came back from this, he didn't tell anybody about his experience. He didn't think about it or write about it too much later, but he's reported later on, on in his autobiography that he said, he came back home and he said, oh, I'll never be able to describe this. I'll never be able to paint this. I think I'll become a tense scientist and try to understand it. How could that be? And so he started working as a chemist, pharmaceutical chemist. He became interested in natural process chemistry. Now, ergot, LSD is an ergot derivative. It's a natural plant substance. It's a fungus that grows on plants. So once he had discovered these and published these results, and see, once you publish a result in the scientific literature, and you publish the result how the drug is made, it becomes a contribution to science. It becomes an international. It can be read by anybody who has the training to read it and decipher the language of chemistry, and it becomes the common good of all mankind. And so, in the last 40 years of his life, after he retired, a steady stream of visitors from all parts of the world, scientists, artists, people that experimented with it, are still exploring it. Here's a list of the people that came to visit, in a partial list from the Hofmann biography. Prominent LSD researchers and experts who came to Rittimate to pay Hofmann their respects. Günther Arment, Matthias Bröckers, Rick Doblin, Amanda Fielding with her husband Jamie Neathpath, Sergius Golovin, Stanislav Grof, Joan Halifax, John Hanna, Michael Horowitz, Stanley Krippner, Timothy Leary, John Lilly, Ralph Metzner, Claudia Miller-Edeling, Jeremy Narby, David Nichols, Jonathan Ott, Manya Palmers, Christian Resch, Andrew Sewell, Anne and Alexander Shulgin, Wolf Ferretz, Franz Bollenweider, and many, many, many others. Unannounced and from all over the world, many people came to Rittimate to see the father of LSD. Hippies, dropouts, Epicureans, and artists. Some of these, quite a few of these uninvited guests were met at the door late in the evening by Hofmann himself, who asked them into his house, spoke with them, offered hospitality. He writes, whenever it was possible, I received these visitors or went on to an agreed upon appointment. I considered it a responsibility that came with my role in the history of LSD, and I've attempted to be a source of information and advice. He actually said to me one time, and he wrote in one of his books that I don't think, of course he acknowledged the value in psychiatry, like that, as a pharmacological instrument, the artistic inspiration, but he said, I don't think that the most significant usage of this that we have yet found, the most significant usage and applications of this substance. I myself think and speculate, based on some of the studies that have been done, I think in many ways one of the most significant application areas will be in helping people to die peacefully and have an understanding. Because everybody dies, as we know, and the common misunderstanding of what dying actually means is extremely widespread. It's been, since the 5th century, it's been the doctrine of the Christian Church to deny reincarnation, and reincarnation is accepted as a fact in all other world religions except Christianity. All other, Hinduism, Buddhism, is taken for granted. And what that does is for many people, you can check this out in your own mind, and they say, no, I'm not just me having these bizarre fantasies, but that other people have had this, and they're recognizing it as something that you could see. See, the difference between a hallucination and a reality perception is +1. +1. If you have a perception and you don't know if anybody else sees it, you might be crazy. But if you could communicate it to one other person, you're not quite so crazy, because 2 people have seen it, and two made the observation of a reality. See, it increases the reality. Then, of course, then you do statistics, and you do, thousands of subjects and like that, observations. So, and then in the identified alchemical symbol with the language of the psyche, and Albert Hofmann, who uncovered the secret link between spirit and matter. And then I also talk about the counterculture movement of the 60s. of the 60s articulated an expansion of collective consciousness and a vision of society centered around humane, ecological, creative, and spiritual values. Because that's what the 60s meant. Yes, it was the anti-war movement, but it was not just anti-war, it was pro-peace, you see. It was the civil rights movement for equality between the races, and it was the environmental, this was the beginning of the environmental movement with what was her name, the woman who wrote Silent Spring, Rachel Carson. You know, and she didn't take psychedelics, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying all these people took psychedelics. Psychedelics was a kind of a yeast in a social transformation. But she had a consciousness expanding experience because the very title, Silent Spring, is consciousness expanding. Because you say, Silent Spring, why? Why aren't the birds singing? And then you find out, well, they're not singing because they've been poisoned by this invisible poison that we don't know about, which the drug companies immediately attacked her because they didn't want her to know about it and spread the news about it. That's 1963, you see, right at the same time. In the civil rights movement, the same thing. Just because somebody has a different color of skin, they have a right to. You know, Martin Luther King says, I want to see black children and white children go to school together, not separate. And all kinds of creative expansions and the creative expressions of psychedelics. Now, the second volume is, I call The Roots of War and Domination, and this is kind of my old personal history. See, I was a war child. I was born in Germany in 1936, and I was 9 years old, and at the end of the Second World War, lived through total social and political collapse, and starvation, and invading armies, and all that kind of thing. And so the roots of war has been one of my lifelong obsessions, you might say, discovery. So I looked in that book at the psychological consequences of child abuse, the historical patterns of resource competition, the mammalian predator behavior. And then, as seeking still deeper roots, I explore the Buddhist myths of power-addicted demons, always fighting with the peaceful demons and the wrathful spirits, the legend of the corruption of the Atlantean civilization, the Nordic myths of wars among different classes of gods, the Sumerian myths of dominating extraterrestrial warlord colonizers. The Sumerian mythology says, well, what we call civilization was imposed by a dominator species from another planet in earlier times. So very few scholars and scientists agree with this theory, but it's as good a theory as any that I've heard. And the profound teachings of Gurdjieff. So all these books in the series, they may sound like a lot, but they're all like 100 pages plus or minus 10 or 20. So I had the idea a few years ago, about 5 years ago, when I started this series, that I don't like to read books anymore that have 200 or 300 pages. That's 400 or 500. I bet other people are the same way.
Yeah.
And the books are not necessarily in a series, but they're all aspects of all the research that I've been doing over the last 30, 40 years. So then the third one is called Alchemical Divination. The subtitle is Accessing Your Spiritual Intelligence for Healing and Guidance. We say alchemy involves teachings and practices of physical, psychic, and spiritual transformation. Divination is the practice of seeking healing and spiritual guidance from inner sources of wisdom and knowledge. The basic purposes of the alchemical divination processes is to help individuals obtain problem resolution and visionary inspiration for their life path in its interpersonal, professional, creative, and spiritual dimensions. And the way I understand the role of psychedelics in these practices, that they can add a kind of amplification process, but they're not essential to it. The same exact processes of self-transformation or helping other people therapeutically can be conducted and are often conducted using other methods of consciousness enhancement, such as meditation, like that. So then the fourth book in the series is called Mind, Space, and Time Stream, Understanding and Navigating Your States of Consciousness. as I mentioned, I no longer use the term altered states, because altered states somehow implies there's one normal state, and any deviation from that is somehow abnormal or pathological. What I argue in this book, the state of consciousness alters all the time. It's not a static thing. But state of consciousness is a division of time. You're in a state of consciousness, we all are in a state of consciousness now. You realize that? It's called the waking state. It goes from when you wake up to when you fall asleep. And then there's the sleeping state, which goes from when you fall asleep to the next time you wake up. And then there's the dreaming state, which is a separate state within the sleep state, when you're having dreams, which can be correlated with EEG waves, and eyeballs moving back and forth. And then the Hindu traditions and the Buddhist tradition recognize a fourth normal state they call Turiya, or the fourth state, which is sort of, I kind of say that it's a kind of an equivalent to a meditative state, when your eyes are closed and your EEG is doing alpha waves very regularly. As soon as you open your eyes and start thinking about something, then it's no longer so regular, you're into beta waves and other kind of waves. So I think actually modern science and brain science recognizes these same primary normal states that we all more or less experience all the time. And then we can have different expansions or contractions of state depending on the set and setting. And usually they will happen depending on the set and setting unconsciously. You know? So, for example, so let me read the description. Each state of consciousness that we experience, ranging from the familiar states of waking, sleeping, dreaming, and meditating, to expansive spiritual and mystical states, has its own distinctly different mind space and time stream. In other words, the way we perceive time and space completely different in each state. It's very easy to demonstrate this to yourself. You may dream that you go visit your mother, who lives 1,000 miles away, and it doesn't take you several hours in a plane to get there. You're as close as you feel. It's emotional, not physical. And the time you may have a flying dream, which you can't do in the ordinary state of consciousness. And it's as real as the other state. It's not a hallucination, it's not a vision. You may have a conversation with the person in your dream. And of course it could be symbolic. Some dreams are symbolic, but some dreams are actually dream encounters with beings. Some human beings and some spiritual beings that we don't recognize and we can't see in the ordinary state of consciousness. So the basic purpose then, we need to learn how to use the expansive positive states for spiritual growth and creative expression, and navigate out of the contractive, unhealthy states of fear and rage, addictions and compulsions, into healthier, life-affirming states. So I'm not saying contracted states are bad and expanded states are good. They both have their good and bad parts. You know, the thing that it depends on is whether it's intentional and under your direction. It's not that, fear and rage are both contracted states of consciousness. When you're afraid, you only see and magnify that which you're afraid of. And you go, magnify the danger. And often it's sufficient just to expand your awareness and recognize what the danger is in your mind. That's what was demonstrated, see, in the studies of the people who had fear of dying. She didn't deny that she was dying once she'd taken the psilocybin. She saw, yes, I can still see, but I can remember, but now, yes, my husband loves me, I have this life, I enjoyed the flowers, the garden, the children, life, for the time that I have. And rage, of course, is notorious. You can't study it because the people who are enraged are not realizing that they're focused. They see red. They see the thing that they don't want. You want to attack it or run away from it. And the very tricky thing is that all psychologists and all of us know, psychotherapists know, the things that can trigger fear and rage can be totally inside your mind. It can be a thought. It can be a perception. Not a real danger. But people can become afraid of the tone of voice of somebody because it reminds them of their mother or their father. And that's also all psychotherapists know, and all who've experienced psychotherapy, is a matter of disentangling these stimuli. So contraction is not, even the contraction of fear has its place, For example, if you're in the street and you're about to step off the curb, and out of the corner of your eye, you see a truck barreling down that you hadn't seen before, you jump back instantaneously in microseconds to safety. You're not concerned about the color of the truck. You're not concerned about what make it is or how long it's going to take to get there. So it's not a matter of eliminating fear, it's eliminating the conditioned fear. And it's not a matter of eliminating the aggressive notion of attack, because you may be in a situation, find yourself in a situation, as for example can happen if you're attacked or if you're in a war situation or any kind of situation, where you mobilize your aggressive energy to fight back, to fight. Because that touches into all the areas of crime and criminality. So basically on the assumption that you want your states of consciousness, you want the practice of your states of consciousness being under your own intentional direction. And then the fourth volume is called The Life Cycle of the Human Soul. And the life cycle of the human soul, that I talk about that, and empirical work in these areas goes like this. It has 6 points. It starts with incarnation, conception, birth, death, the hereafter, reincarnation. And of course, all the other books in all of life, we're mostly concerned with all the stuff that happens between birth and death. But there's a whole area of research in science and experience about prenatal experience. And within that, even there's a whole area that's less studied, but also some preconception experiences. And children can, there's books that have collected stories of children, especially, remembering, choosing to incarnate before conception. The soul choosing. So this goes out of the area of what would not be accepted empirically. I mean, empirical science, there are scientists who study prenatal psychology, and then there's scientists who study after death, or near-death experiences. Near-death experiences are experiences of those people who have actually physically died, but come back because of changes in modern technology, or maybe they've only were dead for a minute or 30 seconds, or maybe they were dead for, as one founded, books about people having near-death experiences are published just about every year, and every year they go to the top of the bestseller list. Have you ever noticed that? There's a tremendous hunger for people to know what happens after you die. And here's somebody who comes back and says, well, this is what I experienced. It's an amazing, I can't remember the exact name, but anyway, you probably know it. An amazing experience of a neurosurgeon,
Proof of
Eben.
heaven.
Any of you know that?
Proof of heaven.
What?
Proof of heaven.
Proof of heaven.
Yeah.
What's the name of the guy?
Eben Alexander.
Eben Alexander, who's a neurosurgeon. A neurosurgeon with postdoctoral training in how the brain works materially. He had a near-death experience that were visits to complex beings and contact with other kinds of angelic and archetypal beings. It lasted 6 days. And he came back. His relatives and doctors were about to pull the plug. He had this virus in his system because they thought he would never regain consciousness, or if he does, he'll be in a vegetative state. And he opened his eyes. And he said, no, I'm coming back. And then he recovered everything. And he recovered, he was able to resume being a neurosurgeon. One of the most profound and powerful proof of heaven, from somebody who was like, okay, he goes through a list in the appendix. It's amazing, all the kind of materialist explanation, 10 different materialists explaining this phenomena away. And he says they're all false. They don't apply. He was in a completely vegetative state for 6 days. Amazing, proof of heaven. Okay, so and then the fifth book is called The Six Pathways of Destiny. In the life cycle of the soul, the life cycle, so I discussed the experience of birth and prenatal life, the unconscious psychic imprints of conception, the soul's choosing of a human incarnation, and the connection with familial ancestors. I also discussed the experience of death of the physical body and the soul's life in the intermediate realms before choosing rebirth into another life. And then this next book is called The 6 Pathways of Destiny. And I say, each of us as a human soul incarnates by choice with a vision for this life, what we came here to do and to be. The soul chooses one or more of 6 great archetypal pathways in which to develop its talents and realize its vision. The 6 archetypal pathways I talk about are 1, the healer peacemaker, 1, the explorer scientist, 1, the warrior guardian, 1, the artist or musician, 1, the teacher historian, and 1, the builder organizer. And they have many variations, and you're not necessarily always just on one path. You can have 2 or 3 or several, but this is a way of just looking at the large varieties of pathways that we may be on, directed, chosen, but then of course we have free will whether to develop that, and we develop, and there's our training plays a role, and so finding your way. So each of the pathways is not only a career or profession, our work in the world, each is also on a deeper level a pathway for manifesting our soul's destiny. And then Worlds Within, Worlds Beyond, which has just been published. I have a few copies here of that one and the Life Cycle book. In this book, I describe 2 multidimensional paradigms we've used in our entheogenic and meditative journeys of exploration and healing. One is the Tibetan Buddhist Wheel of Birth and Death, a mandala of our human journeys through many lives and many worlds. Another is the World Axial Tree, with its upper, middle, and lower worlds, which is also a kind of a universal archetypal symbol. And when you think, the circle is a 2-dimensional representation of the sphere. The Earth on which we live is a spherical planet, and it has a central axis, which is the axis around which you spin. Although in our everyday experience, we experience it as a flat Earth. But shamans have always described their shamanic journeys in going into the upper worlds and the lower worlds to connect with spirits, to find healing knowledge, information, guidance, like that. So I think that's enough. So I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to.
Questions. If you have a question, please speak up.
I would like to know what you know, if anything, about taking subclinical doses of LSD.
What?
Subclinical, I guess, would be the best word for it. Doses, daily doses of LSD. I heard someone talking about this on public radio recently. I think he might have been a researcher himself, and he was just talking about taking an amount that would not really register consciously, but he felt that this was really good for him, that he could, in ways that he could describe that.
Yes, I've heard that some people do that. Hofmann himself actually said and told me and wrote in his book that in his later stages of life he was experimenting with extremely small dose, like 50 micrograms. Usually people think 100 micrograms is sort of the minimum. 40 micrograms, he said, 30. 20, 10, and not to go into an altered state. He said, just to think.
So he felt that he could actually experience something specific on that dose, but not really alter it.
That's right. There are people that I know that are into extreme skiing. They take like 20 micrograms or 50 micrograms and ski down steep mountains. I wouldn't do it, but of course it's illegal. Low doses are just as illegal as high doses.
Have you had any conversations with Oliver Sacks?
No, I have not had the pleasure of meeting him.
How about Thomas Hanna?
I know Thomas Hanna slightly, yeah.
Mark Foy?
Let's ask some questions about the topic.
Is there really a renaissance in psychedelic research that's starting up again?
Yes, because there was none for about 40 years, basically. None. Except, see, there were 2 waves. In the 60s, it was LSD and psilocybin. that were researched, and then the prohibition was the late 60s, 68. That was when it all became illegal. All the researchers handed in their dosages that they had, and those that didn't want to do that went underground, and they couldn't be obtained. So other chemists went set up laboratories, and in this biography, those are talked about at length. And there's recently been a wonderful film made about called The Substance, made by a Swiss. I don't know what it is about the Swiss. They do everything really well. Must be a national characteristic. It's a film that basically covers this whole story. It has fantastic interviews with Hofmann, and it has interviews with Nick Sand, who was one of the major underground chemist manufacturers, who manufactured millions and millions of doses, and spent 10 or more years in jail, paying the price, which he has no resentment about whatsoever. He says that was just part of the price. It's part of the price I paid, but it is interesting to contemplate the fact, that I've been at conferences in Basel and in Switzerland where they had a person come up who's just been condemned to a jail sentence, lost the appeal in England, simply for manufacturing LSD and psilocybin, maybe MDMA, maybe. No heroin, no cocaine, nothing else. Not profiting. So, to me, it's very interesting to think about, and for the people at the conference who were there, and the people who say, "Oh, I took LSD and it changed my life, and I saw God, and it was the most important, profound experience of my life." And the man who made this substance is sitting in jail for the rest of his life. Think about that. What that would do to your consciousness, you see. It would expand your consciousness altogether, but in the direction of making you think, what kind of a society are we living in?
Have you done any experimenting with ayahuasca? Is there a difference do you find between LSD and ayahuasca results?
Yes, one of my books is, I wrote 2 books, actually edited books of accounts of experience with ayahuasca, which is and another one on the experiences with mushrooms, and the sacred mushrooms of Mexico. And in each of those books, there's an initial part that is written by scientists about the pharmacology, the chemistry, the botany, and the indigenous uses of those substances. And then there's a couple of dozen accounts from modern Westerners experiencing these, all anonymous accounts. But that's, so it's a plant that is used for healing and visioning in certain cultures in South America, and that use has spread to modern Western European global culture, and there's an underground network of what?
Is it as profound as LSD?
Absolutely can be as profound as LSD. Ayahuasca particularly has, and so can mushrooms. Ayahuasca has this one peculiar property in the fact that is well known. There's this purging element, and because it is a plant-based substance that stimulates the purging reflex. It's a combination of 2 plants. There's one plant that keeps the substance that expands the mind from being broken down in the body. And so the purging is experienced by people usually we only throw up when we're sick, you see. But the people in ayahuasca, they throw up not because they're sick, but because there's a chemical action going on and thing. And afterwards they feel like ecstatic, They say, wow. I said, well, now I feel like liberated, of this bag of toxicity I was carrying around. And so that's I have the kind of private hypothesis that I edited one book of collection of ayahuasca experience and one on the psilocybin mushroom. To me, they're equally interesting substances and equally profound experiences. But the ayahuasca book has sold about 10 times as many copies as the other one. So there's an ayahuasca kind of wave going on, and I think people really actually, paradoxically, like it. It's throwing up, because it's not throwing up the really sick, it's throwing up the sickness of their lives, you see. This is getting rid of the toxicity of their life. And we know very well that the whole environment in which we live is filled with toxicity, and it includes physical and emotional toxicity of rage and fear and disgust and shame and all that stuff.
They take it every other Saturday.
No. Well, there's a...
Is that a lot to take?
I'm not going to get into judgments about that. There's a religious group that takes it regularly, like going to church. I go to church and throw up, you know. I go to church, but for them it is. They sing hymns, they dance, they sing hymns, they dance, and some of them sit in chairs and dance, and then they throw up every now and again. And then they go back to singing and dancing. Each his own. Burning question.
First, I would like to thank you for the influence your work has had on my life.
You're very welcome.
The Navajo have a ceremony where the shaman takes on the evil of the village and induces nausea ritualistically back into the earth. But my question is, have you ever heard of a man named Antoine Picard's?
Peyote also induces purging. Peyote rituals, they purge, but not as much as with ayahuasca. And peyote ritual is very much a ceremonial. You know, it's not no ecstatic dancing or tripping or anything like that. You sit in the teepee, you stare into the fire, and you stay put for 6 hours. You have to get permission to go pee. You know? And you chant each other. The singers chant all the time.
We have time for one more question.
I thought I heard you quote Hofmann as saying that there is one objective reality. Have you had a conversation with him about that, or how would such a conversation go?
No, that's what, yeah, I was reporting a conversation. He's saying there's one objective reality, but each person creates an image of reality. And the experiences of the psychedelics can make you aware of the fact that you're living in a reality that's actually a constructed reality in your own mind. That's the function of your upbringing, your genetics, your conditioning, what's going on in the world. So that's why people have it in the most profound experiences, the mystical experience. It's all one, right? Cosmic oneness. And cosmic oneness, and that's the same as nirvana in Buddhism, or the highest state, Atma, in Hinduism. Nirvana means nothing. Nothing is happening. It's a state of consciousness. As soon as something is happening, you're no longer in nirvana. As soon as you start thinking about something or intending to do something, you're no longer in nirvana. It's a state of consciousness. And of course, the states of consciousness always need to be integrated. And if they're unhealthy states, then you want to heal them. And if they're expansive, positive states, you want to learn how to use them and apply them in your life for healing, creativity, self-expression, like that.
Okay, Jose Luis.
Thank you. What's your opinion about the 5-MeO-DMT?
Well, 5-MeO-DMT is another substance derived both from, it's actually one of the chemical ingredients in ayahuasca. Ayahuasca actually contains 5-MeO-DMT, DMT, and then the substance that keeps the ayahuasca from being broken down in the stomach. And so it's a visionary substance when taken by itself. It's also present unusually in the secretions of a certain species of toad, which lives around here in the Colorado River toad, of which actually there is no evidence that any of the Aboriginal people used it as such. But people have discovered that it can be taken, and it induces a very powerful experience. Can be, depending on the dosage, can be as powerful as LSD, mescaline, any of these other experiences, but has the advantage that it only lasts about 20 minutes or half an hour, which is a big advantage. I've actually just completed a whole book about it, which will be published later on this year. 5 called The Toad and the Jaguar.
Thank you very much, Ralph, for sharing the wisdom of your experiences with us today.